Well, good morning. Welcome to the Almond Conference. We're so glad you're joining us here in Sacramento and joining us here for this crop estimates and acreage tools session. My name is Bryce Spycher. I'm with the Almond Board of California. I'll be serving as our moderator today. Our hope is to provide you with important information for crop estimation activities, whether they be industry-wide or on a smaller scale. And before I introduce our panelists who will be doing most of the speaking today, I did want to mention that there will be a change to almond crop estimation in 2026. As you have heard, the Almond Board of Directors met on Tuesday of this week and voted to cease funding the NASS Objective Measurement Report. NASS will still publish the subjective report, the grower survey that comes out in May, but will not publish the objective report that would come out in July. Okay, now I'd like to introduce our panelists that we have up here today. On the far left over there, we've got Brock Densel. Brock is our Senior Analyst in Government Affairs at the Almond Board of California. Prior to joining the Almond Board, Brock worked at USDA and had responsibilities with the National Agricultural Statistics Service, or NASS, with their leadership group. Brock works in our Global Technical and Regulatory Affairs group at the Almond Board, where he helps us to follow all the happenings that are going on in Washington, D.C. for our industry stakeholders. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Joel Kimmelshue, sitting next to him. Joel is the founding partner and principal agricultural scientist with Land IQ. While he holds a number of advanced academic degrees, he frequently proclaims that his most impactful educational experience was growing up on a diversified family farming operation, including almonds, in Butte County. That family farm still exists today, and for the past 27 years, Joel has consistently focused on practical and applied scientific solutions for the management of limited land and water resources, specifically in irrigated agricultural systems. Specifically for the Almond Board of California, Land IQ has been providing highly accurate and actionable spatial data and interpretation of that data for the past nearly 15 years. Next, after that, we'll hear from Megan Nunes. She's the founder and CEO of Bountiful Ag, an advanced data science company. Megan provides a unique outlook spanning several industries. With over a decade of experience in the aerospace industry, she has held various levels of leadership, such as COO and CEO of small satellite startups. Her unique combination of skills and experience allow her to lead Bountiful in providing what the agriculture industry really needs while leveraging technology and methods from both the aerospace and the tech industry as a whole. And finally, we'll hear from Stuart McAllister here to my left. Stuart is the president and CEO of Terra Nova Trading, a trading company involved in almonds, cashews, pistachios, and walnuts, headquartered in the Bay Area with offices around the world. And with customers on both the buying and selling side, in the tree nut business, Terra Nova publishes an estimate that comes out in the spring, early in the growing season each year. Stuart and others from Terra Nova jump in the truck and tour orchards all up and down the state every spring and put out their estimate each spring. If you have been here yesterday, you've probably noticed that we're doing question and answers a little bit different this year. We'll be utilizing the QR code. If time permits, we would like to have time at the end of our session to take some questions. Encourage you to scan the QR code. This will be up between each presenter. We will get to as many questions as we have time for. Lunch is immediately after this session, so we'll see what time allots for that, but I know our panelists are eager to take your questions. So please submit them that way. If you do provide us your contact information and we don't get to your question today, we will follow up with you after the conference. So with that, we'll start. I'll have Brock come up here. Brock will begin our conversation with discussing the USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service, the history of crop estimation work, and how crop estimates have been used at the Almond Board. So please welcome Brock.
Hi there, thanks Bryce, and thanks everyone for joining us this morning. I'm going to attempt to keep this rather brief. It is a little bit of a history lesson, just on running through a bunch of dates and the like. So I don't want to bore you to death, but we will just kind of run through a little bit of history here. So the first agricultural estimate done by the United States was all the way back in 1791. George Washington received a letter from an English farming expert and went out and actually sort of just did the survey on his own in order to do it back then. And he was able to reply back to that inquiry that came in and provide that very first crop report for the United States. He actually then proposed to create a board of agriculture, which would have been primarily on the statistical side, and that was shot down by Congress a few years later. It would be quite a bit later until President Lincoln was actually the one to found the United States Department of Agriculture. It's often called the People's Department because that is really where their focus is responding to the folks in the United States. And then one of the very first functions of the Department of Agriculture was on the research side. You see this, the very next year after the department was created, they created the Division of Statistics, which, through 100 years of history, 100 plus years of history here, where has, ended up being NASS. They did not waste any time. They published their very first crop report that very same year as they were established. And again, we've gone through a bunch of different names for what NASS is and over the years. I also want to talk a little bit about the history of the Almond Board, and I kind of want to weave those together here on the slide following this. But 1937 Depression-era policy led to the creation of marketing orders as an entity across the United States. It wouldn't be until 1949 where, through an act of Congress, almonds were added to that list of commodities that were eligible to create marketing orders. And then again, the very next year, the Almond Board was created out of that legislation. There are a couple of important points here that I do want to make about that very first version of the marketing order, all the way back in 1950, which is that there was included in those provisions that required the board to provide an estimated production of almonds. And in the early days of the marketing order, there was also a requirement for the Almond Board's budget, just like a very top line number, to be published in the Federal Register. And in order to do that, the Department of Agriculture required that all data that accompanies that recommendation would need to be included in what the Almond Board sent up as well. It turns out the Department of Agriculture has been doing almond estimates for a very long time. The very first one I could find was all the way back in 1937. It could have gone back further than that. That's as far back as I've been able to find records for anything. And you can actually see it here on the slide. I was able to track down the actual PDF copy of it all. And obviously the industry's changed quite a bit between then and now. As the Almond Board was then established in 1950, we don't have any sort of direct comparison to say they were using the USDA NASS numbers at that point in time, but the things that they had published in the Federal Register, the numbers match up pretty well for us to kind of make that assumption that even for those first couple of years, they were using some sort of NASS data to come up with those, with all of that information. The very first time that we see it referenced is in 1954. That's where they specifically call out that they were using those NASS numbers. And then from 1954 until 1968, it was all of the same crop report that came out every year. It actually came out typically in July at that time. And that was what ABC used, again, to sort of meet those statutory requirements that I laid out earlier. It did that all the way up until 1968. And 1968 was then the very first objective version of the estimate that USDA put out. And they had actually started work on that estimate 6 years before that estimate came out, all the way back in 1962, where they were sending folks out here to California to take all of the measurements required for them to be able to produce some kind of a number. And at the time, they noted, and this is in that 1968 report, that the reason that they were doing this was to fulfill the industry's need for an accurate forecast prior to harvest. The oldest known objective measurement that we have, that we still have access to, let me put it that way, because obviously there's this one in 68, but the continuously on back, we can go all the way back to 1986 for those objective measurements, and we've been using that objective measurement number to fulfill those marketing order and statutory requirements all the way up until this next year. So I've kind of referenced what those requirements were in the past. I do want to kind of point out just a couple of what those requirements look like today. Two of them are kind of, they hint at, we kind of need some sort of a number to reference to. And then the middle one there, I think, is pretty direct in that in order to fulfill some marketing order requirements, we have to provide the secretary with a quantity of marketable almonds that we expect to be produced. So all of that sort of comes together in what we have to do, in how we have like some requirements that we're required to fill as a marketing order, and how we've done it using NASA data in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Brock. I appreciate that overview. Yeah, thank you. That was a great overview. I think now as we transition to talking about crop estimation, one of the big factors when you talk about crop estimation, obviously, is acreage. And who better to talk about acreage than Joel Kimmelshue from Land IQ? So I want to welcome Joel up. He's going to share some interesting trends that are happening with their spatial mapping and almond acreage. So welcome, Joel.
Thanks, Bryce. It's a pleasure to be here today. I want to just say, to start off by thanking the Almond Board for inviting me to be here and speak. The second thing I want to say is a theme that you'll hear throughout this presentation, and that is, let's get our footprint right. So we are the acreage, age, location entity that does the work for the Almond Board for quite some time, and we're very proud of that work at Land IQ, and I'll get into it right away. What is Land IQ? We're a group, been in existence for about 18 years. We're a group of land-based scientists and spatial scientists. We purposely put those two disciplines together. We married them together because we inform one another about the work that we do. It's been a great marriage. I will give credit to the Almond Board. The Almond Board was the very first commodity group that employed us to do this work. And they knew early on that we needed to get that footprint right, and so we built this company, and it matched very well with what the Almond Board required. So I'm going to talk about four things: acreage, location, age, and then I'm going to defer to a couple other speakers the yield estimate. That's the pounds per acre per block, if you will. But I always say, again, I'll say it again, get your footprint right. So we're going to talk about how many actual producing acres are out there. We're going to talk a little bit about the difference between standing acreage and producing acreage. Where are these actual production acres occurring? We know there's differences in yields across the state from north to south by acre. How old is every orchard? We know there's a difference in age of orchards and the yield associated with the age of an orchard. And then I'll introduce kind of my personal opinions on how to estimate the part about pounds per acre. Multiply a bunch of those things together and you should be able to get a perfect estimate, right? Every time, every year. The problem is you have this thing called a natural system of crop production that has this natural variability in it that is challenging. Okay, how many acres are actually out there? A little history lesson. Back in about 2010, the growers on the board of the Almond Board looked at the government USDA NASS average yield numbers, pounds per acre in the state. And the growers said, I think I'm a pretty good grower, but I cannot achieve the average yields. So what do you have? Pounds, numerator, acres, denominator. Well, the numerator, that runs across the scale, and that's where the dollar sign is. And so that's done pretty accurately. So their hypothesis, as a scientist, we like to use those words, was that the acreage was too low. And so if you're dividing through by a number that's too low, you're going to have an elevated pounds per acre. And so they said, Land IQ, go figure out the acreage in the state. So we did it for Madera County first, and then we did it for, we gave the map to the growers on the Almond Board of California, and they said, we think you got lucky, do it again. So then we did it again for Madera County, and then they said, do the whole state. So in the beginning, it was totally grower driven, and it was standing acres only. No differentiation between removed, abandoned, stressed, things like that, just standing acreage. And then they said, Great, that looks pretty good. How many actual producing acres are out there? And the image on the right-hand side of this slide is a report that we provide that is access, you all have access to through the Almond Board website. We do this twice a year because the Almond Board is very active and know this is a very important piece of information. So all these data are at your fingertips, publicly available through the Almond Board website. So how many actual producing acres are there? So then the Almond Board said, tell us bearing and non-bearing, not just standing, but let's split it up into bearing and non-bearing, so one more refinement. And so the question then is that all we need to know? Because the acreage of almonds during that time was increasing very rapidly, and everything was just being planted, and there were the normal removals, but those were much less than the planted acres. And then the Almond Board said, fine, or the growers said this, now we want to get more refined. So we want to know standing versus producing. We want to know what orchards may be standing but abandoned. We want to know what orchards may be standing but stressed. And of course, we want to know things that were removed. And you can see on the figure on the center on the bottom there, we're seeing a decline in total acreage. But we're also seeing a decline in decline in plantings and an increase in removals. So when that happens, the bearing acreage kind of flatlines, and that's where we're at. Okay, so that's acreage. Second piece of the equation is location. So where are those orchards? That's where the spatial mapping comes into play, which is very important. So we know every block of almonds in the state of California, about an acre or 2 acres and greater, with 99% accuracy. We know that through ground truthing and all the things that we do that I won't go into ad nauseum about today. But we can, because we have that mapping, we have that spatial footprint, we can then overlay things on top of it, like counties, or groundwater sustainability agencies, or groundwater only agencies, irrigation districts, things like that, to better enhance the interpretation of this map. You saw the map in previous slides. So the interesting thing in this slide is this, the red bottom of the stacked bars, it represents southern counties. The yellow part of the stacked bar represents central counties, and the blue part represents northern counties. So these are the proportion of the total acreage in those regions. You can do this by county, you can do it by any other spatial overlay that you would like, but for the purposes of this, I just want to point out a few things. You know, when I was a kid growing up on an almond farm, we thought, what's going on? They're planting almonds south of Merced. Are you kidding me? That should never happen. That never happened before. That's all cotton ground. Now, so that grew. So, but from 2010 to 2025, the proportion of the total acreage of almonds in California has decreased in the southern counties by 5%. We can talk about why that is, but it has. Where has it gone? And this is speculation that's been in the almond industry for sure, but now we can prove it because we have the spatial mapping. So where has it gone? It's gone to the central and the northern counties. Now, yes, there are less acres, but the proportionality. Now, why does that matter? Because yields generally increase from north to south. Yields in the south are greater. So if you know where that change is and you can apply that change and apply a yield to that change, you're much more accurate in trying to estimate yield. Third of 4 categories, age. How old is every orchard? We know that there's a relationship between yield and age. Yields increase with age to a point, and then they kind of plateau. But so the Almond Board of the growers on the Almond Board of California said, fine, you got everything mapped, you know where the standing acres are. Now we want to know the age of every single orchard everywhere. So we employed a methodology to look at what the age was, and it's about plus or minus 1 year at about 95% confidence interval. So this is just an image of age blocks of almonds near Chowchilla, and then the age legend is on the right-hand side. So not only do we know the blocks, we know the age, and again, there's a correlation between age and yield. And I gave some simple stats from cost and return studies from UC Davis, just to give an idea. Those are the year 3 age or yield, 600 pounds the acre, 4, 1,200, 5, 2,400, 6, 2,800, etc. That's different in the north. Those numbers are different in the central. So if you know that footprint, again, you can apply these units of pounds per acre of yield more accurately to what's actually happening. Okay, so we took that age, and one of the most important, most interesting components right now about almonds is we're seeing removals. For the first time, there's significant removals occurring. So these 5 figures are acres on the vertical axis and age of each of those years, 1 through 40. 1-year-old orchards, 40-year-old orchards, 5 times, okay? In 2020, the average removal age was about 25 years old, or the peak removal age is about 25 years old. The removed acres are on the bottom of almost 30,000 acres. In 2021, the removed acres was almost 57,000 acres. And we start to see a second peak appearing, a younger peak. In 2022, an increase in removal, 60,421 acres. We start to see that bimodal distribution, or that second peak, increasing, a younger removal age. Then in 2023, almost 83,000 acres of removed orchards. And finally, and that earlier peak is beginning to dominate. Look at the color scheme on there. And then in 2024, the average or the peak removal age now, 5 years later, is 3 years less. So this age component comes into play about estimating yield on a landscape. And in there's the stats on the 2025. I would have put that in there, but it scrunched things up a little bit too much. But you get the idea. So we see this increase in removals and a decrease in the age of when those orchards are removed. You couldn't do this without spatial mapping and age detection and where. The next question on this, and I didn't even go into it, is where are those young peaks? Are they in critically overdrafted groundwater basins? Are they in water short areas? Where are they? Another thing I want to point out on this side, look at the last slide, 2024, the last figure, 2024. Look at the low end of that, 1 through 10 years old. We're beginning to see, I don't know if this is a trend or not, but there are young orchards being removed. Is that a function of price? What do we know? Okay, and then the last piece that I'm not going to talk about, I'm going to leave that up to the next 2 speakers because that's a difficult one. Figuring out the acreage, age, and location was difficult too, but we're very proud of the work that we've done. So we know now that we have highly accurate acreage, about 99% accurate. We know that through independent ground truthing data. We know the location, you've seen that, and we know the age. So we've got 3 of the 4 variables determined. We're 75% of the way there. Great. So how is that last variable determined? Just my personal opinion. We do our crop mapping with what's called multiple lines of evidence. And I think we do have multiple lines of evidence to get to pounds per acre on a block. And so I suggest we look at field observations still in some fashion. We look at modeling approaches, which our speakers are going to talk about, in some fashion. We look at crowdsourcing. We look at the industry. The local knowledge is the best, and the growers are the best to know what's going on there. All of these have strengths and limitations, but if you're objective in how you look at those different lines of evidence, combine them accurately together as best you can, you should be able to get to what I would hope is a yield estimate that's about plus or minus 2 to 5% on an annual basis. So I thank you for your time. I want to recognize my contributors from Land IQ. A bunch of them are here today, and I'm happy to answer questions later. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. I want to thank the Almond Board of California for inviting me to share Bountiful with you all today and the way in which that we forecast almonds, because it is rather different than counting nuts on a tree. So I'm going to start with who is Bountiful? What are we? Bountiful is a data technology company that happens to work in the agriculture industry. We have developed an operating system for agriculture, and what that means is we essentially leverage data to service farmers, buyers, and sellers, depending on what their specific need is. We work in a variety of permanent specialty crops: almonds, walnuts, pistachios, apples, cherries, citrus, and grapes. And I always think it's helpful to talk about what the goal is, because I don't take it for granted that not a lot of people probably know who I am. So I grew up in the Central Valley of California. I'm from a farming family. I worked in the aerospace industry for about 10 years. And while I was working in aerospace, I learned how the U.S. forecasts corn, wheat, and soy. And specifically, it's through a linear relationship to a satellite imagery index called NDVI. I then learned that in the permanent crop world, the way that we forecast crops is all done by hand, specifically by counting either nuts or bushes of grapes and so on, or bunches of grapes, and so on. And so I wanted to figure out, is there a way to basically apply a data technique to forecasting permanent crops? And that is the whole way in which this whole crazy journey started about 10 years ago. We started in wine grapes and eventually moved into almonds, which has been kind of our baby and bread and butter for the last several years. Who are our customers and who do we work with? So for farmers, we do things that typically mean data automation. So that means taking your PDF reports from field runs, turnouts, USDAs, digitizing them and centralizing them into one place. For buyers and sellers, it means forecasting future supply, forecasting price. And I'm going to walk through specifically today the two different ways in which Bountiful forecasts supply and talk about the methodologies that we employ. So we'll start with our approach in season. And so when I mean in season, I mean the forecast Bountiful releases pre-harvest. And the way that we do that is we have developed over 15 different models that we are running every day in order to understand the changes in relationship to climate and weather, different satellite imagery indexes and how those are changing over time, in order to understand what yield is and where yield is actually trending and moving. The way that we select a model is we use something called MAPE, which is the mean average performance error that stands across all of our models in order to understand what the performance of that model is. The model with the best MAPE and the best standard deviation becomes what we call the chosen model, and that is how the selected forecasted yield gets determined. We typically use anywhere from 5 to 7 years worth of data, and we run this whole forecasting process at various spatial scales. So we forecast the entire state of California, every county that almonds are grown in, and at the field level for our farm customers who are interested in understanding what their field outcomes are going to be. So on this slide here, you will see what Bountiful's forecasted ranges are for this year, for 2025-2026. We released our first forecast in April, then another one in May, June, and July, and it's typically released during the second week of the month, is usually the cadence in which that we operate on. So the median range of Bountiful's forecast is 267 to 276 billion pounds for this season. That's taking the forecasted yield multiplied by acres in order to give you just a simple, easy range. There's also lower and upper bands to all of the forecasts that we release, which are typically plus or minus 5% from the median. The lower band of our forecast this season are 2572 at the extreme low end, and on the high end, 2863. So once we get into the receiving period of almonds, so that would be in August, we begin looking at where is crop supply trending, and we use different models for this process. We use something called a sigmoid and log function. What that essentially means is as the almond crop supply comes in exponentially, that's when we leverage a sigmoid function, or a log function, and then as it turns over, we leverage a sigmoid function in order to understand where the crop supply is going to end up at a given point in time. Typically by the November position report, the almond industry receives anywhere from 76 to 88% of the crop. By December, we're at 91 to 97%, and by January, we're at 96 to 99%. So these are trends and data that we will use in order to input where we think the crop supply is going to turn out. At the very end of my presentation, I will give you a teaser as to where we think the crop supply will end this year based on the latest position report. So one of the things that I wanted to share for those in this room who are interested in applying a data methodology to forecasting yield, whether it is for your processing operation or in your own field, where that all really starts is with good data collection. So if you're a grower, what I mean by good data collection is taking your USDA net meats that you get from your processor, take those total production values by variety, as well as your contributing bearing acres, and breaking all that down, and then divide those numbers together in order to understand your yield. And you should do this for as many years as you have history for. The reason why is because there are certain varieties that we have seen tend to alternate bear. And to Joel's point earlier, age changes your yield curve. And there are years where certain ages perform a certain way and other years where they do something you maybe don't expect. And so understanding those trends for your actual operation can help give you insight. The easiest way you could do this yourself would be leveraging literally Excel and just tracking all this information in one place. And that would be the best way to get started. So to talk about our current view, following the November position report, the California almond crop is currently trending into the low to median range of Bountiful's April forecast, which is 267 to 257 billion pounds. Now, while I share this with you all, I will also tell you that next month, when we have new data, Bountiful will change its mind on what we think the crop supply is going to be based on the updated and most recent information. So here you can see the median range too of all of our forecasts. It's in the bottom table. It's a little tight, but hopefully if you take a photo, you can zoom in with your camera and get that for you. Thank you so much. And next we'll get to hear from Stuart and how you actually count nuts and get the data from under the canopy. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Good morning. One more. There we go. So I'd say, I always feel like the not so smart kid in a classroom when I stand up here. Very low tech approach compared to these fine colleagues here. But I'd say the one question we often get, basically from everybody, is why do we bother doing a crop estimate every year? I can certainly tell you with my colleagues in the room that after 7 to 8 days in a pickup truck with 2 other gentlemen, we usually are asking ourselves the same question at the very end of it. But to understand kind of the history and the reason for us to start this early estimate, we started a long time ago. This crop estimate this year is actually our 30th crop estimate. It was born out of frustration, not too dissimilar to this year, where we had a very chaotic and very volatile market in 1995. You have to kind of put things in context because the numbers look ridiculous nowadays. We just come off our biggest crop in history at 735 million pounds. We then had a subjective estimate of 430 million pounds. We then had an objective estimate of 310 million pounds. And I can tell you within 24 hours of that estimate being released, that was the very first time I'd ever traded almonds above $3 a pound. It's a big historical moment for me, that one. And then the crop ended up being 370 million pounds. So we had this kind of seesaw, terrible price volatility. And so out of that, Michael Grant decided that there's got to be a better way to provide information early on in order that we can actually start to make some smart marketing decisions. There always seemed to be just this lack of information, a lot of what I would call horror stories or coffee shop talk. Always the worst areas were the most vocal about how poor the crop was. And typically what Michael and myself found was that you'd ask growers or you'd ask handlers like the crop and they'd say it's just absolutely terrible. And then when you quizzed like how much of the state they'd seen, you'd find that they've just driven the 10 miles from their house to the plant and that was it. And so you're like, well, how can you make a comment on the entire crop if you've not seen the entire crop? So that was the real reason for Michael starting. And really, we just wanted it more to be a kind of starting point for all industry stakeholders, both buyers and sellers, to really start a starting point to discuss supply and demand for the upcoming new season. And that was the idea of an independent view, not just what growers wanted to hear, not just what buyers wanted to hear. We wanted to be, as we're in the middle, we wanted to kind of provide what we thought it was so that buyers and sellers could talk about it. Essentially, we were just trying to get to a level playing field for everyone to have more confidence in making new crop marketing decisions if they were deciding to sell prior to harvest. So how do we go about doing our estimate? It's always starting, really, as Megan and they've said, is really starting by actual data, is looking at, okay, how did we do last year? How are the actual yields from the growers and the handlers and everybody that we work with? How do they compare to the estimates that we made on each of those orchards? And we have, I'd say, a large portion of our orchards, we're able to get the actual yield data. And so this essentially becomes like our scorecard and working out, okay, how well did we do? Did we miss certain areas? Did we miss certain varieties? And it's a really important kind of autopsy on how we did each year before we head out into the field the following year. The next thing we do is analyze Land IQ data that comes out in November, and I personally want to thank Joel for starting that all those years ago. It has made our job so much easier to be able to drive around the Central Valley with your iPhone and to be able to tell in an orchard how many acres and what age it is. It is revolutionized what we do. So again, thank you, Joel. And then essentially, we, after collecting and analyzing all of Land IQ data, we essentially try to represent California as a whole. We essentially look at how many acres are in each county and the proportion to the entire state. We look at tree age demographics, and then we look at using the ABC position report. We work on crop receipts by variety and by county to look at, again, how did we do last year? Are there any noticeable trends? Which way is the industry going? Then the good bit. Then we get on the road. Like I said, from sun up to sundown, we essentially look at 60 to 70 orchards every day, from all the way in the north to all the way in the south. We always look at the same orchards every year until at such point that we turn up to the orchard and it's been removed. And then when we see an orchard's been removed, we replace that with a new bearing acres or bearing orchard in the same area in order to represent our sample set. So again, to put it in context, we covered 560 different orchards in 2025, and 3 of us each made independent readings in those orchards in different parts of that orchard. So again, we feel like this really is the most important part of our estimate, is really the number of data points that we're collecting when we do our estimate. Last year was nearly 1,700 data points across the entire state. And again, the other important point is to make sure that you have a good representation of the California's acreage as a whole. So, it's like a scorecard. How do we do over the last 14 years? We've kind of picked, like comparing these estimates since 2011. Really, we feel that this is what we call in the office the modern era. This is when we started having 2 billion pound crops and bigger. And the one thing you'll notice is, again, it's sad when you spend 8 days on the road, there's no clear winner. TNT is subjective, the objective, all 8 times out of 14 within 5%. Within 3%, the subjective is the winner there. They've managed that 6 times, we've managed it 5. The objective only twice. And then when you get to within 1%, at least here I can say we did okay. We've got it 3 times, the subjective only once, and the objective only once. And so I think in all of this, it just points to how difficult it is to estimate a crop. And again, you know, it's been a hot topic this week. Let's be honest. And I think a lot of people have been very frustrated with this year's objective estimate. But I would say it is really interesting to know, or at least for me, that over the last 5 years, the objective estimate has been the most accurate. So I'll just make that comment and I'll move on. And again, I did want to stress, all of these comments, all of these opinions are Terra Novas, not necessarily the almond boards. So, and it's all about the acreage. With 1.4 million bearing acres, any slight change in yield makes a huge difference to your total crop estimate. And so, but back to the reason why we started this, it's really, for us, it was more than just a number. We don't just, you know, you'd be amazed how many people read our 6-page report and say, couldn't find a number, where is it? Tell me what page. You're like, why don't you read the whole thing? And so, realistically, you know, for us, what Michael started out to do was really portray a kind of state of the industry and highlighting the trends from a supply side point of view. You know, what's going on with variety receipts, we've seen that change with, you know, Butte Padres all now being removed, independents coming on board, non-pareil. I mean, you see those trends coming and you see them when you get out in the field. More recently, we've seen a lot more abandoned orchards removals, given the grower economics and what's been going on since 2020. You see the new plantings. There's been, you know, essentially from 2013 to 2018, huge plantings, and you've seen that dramatically slow down in the last few years. And all of this is as Joel says, is pointing towards, you know, where are future yields heading? You know, what are we likely to produce as an industry? We're seeing the change go from south, it's moving east and it's moving north away from less secure water areas. And so again, the real reason for us to do this report was really to try and benefit all industry stakeholders in their, essentially their marketing efforts. Essentially, we're as a marketing company, we wanted everybody to have this information on a level playing field and for everybody to be able to make decisions based on the entire state, not just, as we say, some of those horror stories or problem areas that you hear every year. And they exist and they're real for those growers. I mean, if we talk about Kern County in 2024 or Western Fresno this year, there are real horror stories with growers being 25, 30% off this year. But that's what's very vocal. But we also know growers this year in Kern County who are 60% up. So in order to portray that to everybody, it helps both buyers, sellers, growers, everybody to make marketing decisions should they choose to going forward. And really, that's what we want our estimate to be, is really a starting point for discussion. It's about allowing growers and handlers and buyers to be able to take that information, and I'd call it an efficient market, but not necessarily always, a transparent market, transparent information, and be able to make decisions and be able to hedge their price risk should they choose to do it. And that was really the basis of why we started this estimate. So every year before we go on the road, the last question we ask is there any room for improvement? And I can tell you in a short word, the answer is always yes. And so what we're going to focus on in the future is really continuing to collect as much actual yields from our estimated orchards as possible. It's always very helpful to be able to see where you went wrong, which areas, why. And so that's a big focus in our improvement in the future. This year, we've started experimenting with some nut counting technology on iPhones. It's kind of interesting. It's probably a little further away than we'd like. But it is interesting to consider. Again, for us, we're no different. We essentially are making our Terra Nova's own subjective estimate. It is 3 individuals making a decision on the crop yields in those orchards. So in some way, using this nut counter technology in order to get more of an objective estimate is some area that we're going to focus on our resources and see what we can do with that in the future. And then using these kind of improved data to really to kind of better assess future trends, and then also trying to increase somehow, I'm not sure my colleagues would appreciate me saying this, but trying to make our sample set just that bit bigger and our data points a little larger. Sorry, guys.
What time in the truck?
So, again, our goal that we've set ourselves is to be consistently within 5% plus or minus, which statistically is pretty darn good, but it is still 100 pounds an acre. And on 1.4 million bearing acres, that's 140 million pounds. But if we could consistently do that, I'd call that a result. But obviously with the recent decision made this week by the Almond Board to stop the objective estimate, I do think this is a really golden opportunity for us as an industry with a lot of smart people really to come together and to focus our efforts on how can we as an industry find new ways and new methods combined with all the amazing smart people here to come to a place to try and find a way to do estimates where we can get within 2.5%. That, for me, again, as a marketing company, would aid everyone in making those decisions in terms of, do they want to sell? Do they want to buy? Do they like this price? Do they want to hedge this price risk? And that, to me, is the ultimate goal. So with that, I hope you all accept the challenge. And yeah, good luck with it. Thank you.
All right, thank you. That was wonderful. We covered a lot of ground right there. I want to encourage those that have questions. The QR code is on the screen right here. If you would like to scan that and submit a question, we would love that. And I think we do have a few minutes before our session time wraps up. To start us off, though, I might direct a question. I think I'll direct it to you, Megan. You had mentioned that Bountiful puts out yield estimates, kind of revises them throughout the year as you get more information. I'm thinking about if there's a grower or someone looking to do their own estimation of their fields, is there a certain time of the year that you found to be best when you're trying to estimate future yield?
Yeah, so at Bountiful, our April forecast, actually, interestingly enough, tends to be our best performing forecast. Now, that being said, if you are a grower forecasting in April with eyes and counting things, that's very challenging because there's very little things to basically actually count and see. My suggestion would essentially be after what is called June drop that typically happens in May, would be that time period would be the time that you would want to estimate and see what is actually happening in your orchard. And I would also say do not just do the outsides, definitely go to those hard to reach places on the insides because yield tends to look very different on the outside of the orchard than it does on the inside. The other piece I would add too is variety trends are very interesting in almonds. For a long time, I did not believe that alternate bearing was like truly a thing until I actually saw it. Varieties definitely alternate bear. There are varieties that tend to follow each other at the block level as well. At least that's what we see on our grower yield data. So have your numbers when you're doing it.
Okay. Wonderful. Tim is collecting questions for us. Tim, do we have any questions that have come in yet? If not, I've got another question I can ask.
Yeah, we have a number of questions, Bryce, so I'll go ahead and start off with the first one. We've seen a number of removals over the past few years and an increase in removals. When will we start to see decreasing bearing acreage after 4 years of decreasing non-bearing in total acreage? Joel, I think that's a question.
Joel, I think that one's for you.
Is that for me? Is that one mine? Yeah, so it's a bank account, debits and credits. Debits are removals, credits are plantings, and the credits are a delayed actual deposit in your account because they have to get through the non-bearing phase before they start to take an impact on the bearing acreage, and then even in the first couple years they're lower yielding. So when will that happen? I tell people everybody has a number in their head. It should be this number. Or if I'm a grower, it should be this number. And if I'm a buyer, it should be this number. I'm sorry, the number that we give you is the number, and it takes time for that lag effect of going from non-bearing to bearing. If you looked at the figures that I presented in the slides, you're seeing the non-bearing acreage tailing off. You're seeing the bearing acreage plateau, and there's about a 3 or 4 year plateau in that bearing acreage number. And so I'd like to predict that 10,000 acres of almonds will be planted next year and 90,000 acres will be removed, we're headed, then your bearing acreage goes down. But it's truly a lag effect. And while I remember, because I forgot during my presentation, but one thing I want to say is just think where we'd be today if the almond board didn't take that aggressive action in 2010 and say, we got to get that denominator right. So we got to know the acres. We wouldn't be talking as much about, we'd be talking about what is the pounds per acre. We'd also be talking about how many acres are out there and how old are they and where are they. So we're headed in the right direction, absolutely. But that last piece is tricky. And I think our two speakers that are specialized in that express that. So hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. We have another question here. I think this one's for Megan. First of all, comment, great panel. But I know growers are concerned about data and AI. How are you balancing AI and managing grower privacy?
Yeah, so that is a great question to whoever asked that. Bountiful actually has a very strict policy in terms of how we view grower data. Our grower data belongs to our growers. It does not belong to Bountiful. Bountiful essentially sits on it the same way a bank account sits on money in a trust account. It's your money, but it's technically in the bank. So the way that we handle grower data, grower privacy of their data, everything sits very separate. The way that we do things at the field is very different than the way that we use data at the state. We also use different data sets for forecasting at the field than we do at the state as well. Outside of that, in terms of the question on AI, so I didn't touch on the AI work that we do at Bountiful. Technically, machine learning is under the umbrella of AI. But how that works is we use something called GCP, which stands for the Google Cloud Platform. We leverage their security standards, and all the models that we employ, it's all in basically a firewalled closed environment. So that information is not being used to train Google's Gemini model in any way. It is only being used at Bountiful for the specific purposes in which that data is intended to be used for.
All right. Have another question related to forecasting. What is being done to accurately account for abandoned acreage? So, Stuart and Megan, I think this is probably a question for you.
Abandoned acreage, maybe Stuart, you want to take a stab at it, and then maybe Joel or something? So, or Megan, either one.
You know, the abandoned acre question, we struggled with this over the last 4 or 5 years as we've come across it. And it is interesting as you watch each year. If you see the same orchards every year, you know, suddenly you start to see it become stressed. And then essentially, if they are, as Joel will point out, still standing, we have taken an approach. We had 2 different methods. It was like, okay, do we score this 0 and we add that to our average because it is still standing acres, or do we essentially use Land IQ data to come up with, again, our acreage number is lower, not because we don't think Joel's number is right, it's more we believe, okay, let's base our number based on how many acres are going to be harvested. So in terms of the abandoned orchards, I think it really, you know, take your pick. Use the larger acreage number and include your zeros for yield, or use a lower number and just include the yields of the orchards that are going to be harvested. So again, that's our low-tech approach.
Our high-tech approach is we've developed a methodology in which, no offense, Stuart, I'm sorry.
Untaken.
We've developed a methodology that can identify kind of phases of stress. And the high-end phase of stress, of course, is abandon, and those kind of stick out like a sore thumb. But we still include them in the standing acreage. But if someone wanted to get to producing acreage, it's probably a wise idea to take those out. Now, we have stress levels of stress trees too. And one year we'll classify an orchard as stressed. And then the next year it's even more stressed, so headed towards abandon. And then one time, and sometimes two, it's stressed, and then it recovers. Yeah. So that stressed number is wiggly, and it's just a grower decision. Are they going to put the inputs in? Are cost inputs really high? Are they just going to kind of limp it along, or are they really walking away from it? But it takes that too as a lag effect. You're going to see that transition back to a normal producing orchard, or transition to ultimately abandoned orchard. And oh, by the way, Taking out an orchard isn't cheap either. I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing more orchards still standing. They're abandoned because it's expensive to do that, and maybe the grower can't get to that this year. And so there's lots of variables that come into play, but abandon sticks out like a sore thumb for us.
Well, thank you. I think in the interest of time, we maybe have time for one more question. This has been a great discussion. Thank you everyone for your questions submitted. So, Tim, do we have one more?
Yeah, so we've seen a couple of questions related to Sigma and the implications with almond acreage, and I know the Almond Board has recently expanded the scope of work with Land IQ to look at this a little bit, so I think it's a timely question, probably for Joel. But what do you see as far as the implications related to Sigma? And then another pointed question on this is how many planted acres of almonds are there currently in white areas?
I don't know the number of acres of almonds off of my top of my head in white areas or groundwater only areas, but we absolutely can determine that, and we have. I just can't remember what it was. Yeah, Sigma absolutely is impacting the footprint. We see it. I think that earlier bump in the removals that I showed that are now at 22 years is partly impacted by Sigma. I think that's partly impacted by price. Growers are like, oh, I'm just going to take it out, and then well, the price is down, I'm going to plant a new orchard, and then I'm going to wait for the price to come up and that type of thing. Sigma is the most impactful program that will not just impact almond industry, but all of agriculture in critically overdrafted groundwater basins. We work in a number of GSAs for determining consumptive use of crops on a block-by-block basis for the water balance part, and we're seeing that land use, and so we do the land use stuff too. We see that land use changing most dramatically, as you might imagine, in the critically overdrafted groundwater basins. And the fascinating thing is, what was it, and what is it going to? It's fascinating because we historically would see annual crops replaced by permanent crops. Well, permanent crops have a hard water demand. We got to have it every year. Now we're kind of seeing the opposite. Some of the permanent crops going out, and the growers kind of, I got a little water this year, I'll put an annual crop, and I don't have the risk. I can follow it the following year if I have a water issue. So the land use in California, especially in the San Joaquin Valley, is changing dramatically.
Well, wonderful. I think we'll leave it there. Thank you for all your questions submitted and your attendance here today. I'd like to just personally thank each of our panelists today. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you guys for this great session.